I've talked about Marcion and his view of the Old Testament and the New Testament as incompatible, as giving us either descriptions of two different gods or at least two incompatible descriptions of the same God. Today I want to talk about his greatest opponent, Tertullian. Tertullian was a Berber from Carthage in North Africa. He was one of the great early church fathers, somebody who, maybe more than anyone else, really helped to characterize what Christianity is. He was surely, along with Irenaeus, the most significant Christian theologian of the 2nd century. Tertullian was also a brilliant writer, someone who I think had not only immense power intellectually and inexhaustible energy writing a huge amount during his lifetime, but also wrote with a tremendous power and such a flair that he's a delight to read. Now, there are not very many philosophers or theologians that are really a great pleasure to read, but Tertullian is one of them. And so I'm going to actually read you part of his Jeremiad against Marcion, because it's just so remarkable. The Euxine Sea, we'd call it the Black Sea today, is self-contradictory in its nature and deceptive in its name. As you would not account it hospitable from its situation, so it is severed from our more civilized waters by a certain stigma which attaches to its barbarous character. The fiercest nations inhabit it, if indeed it can be called habitation, when life is passed in wagons. They have no fixed abode, their life has no germ of civilization, they indulge their libidinous desires without restraint, and for the most part naked. Moreover, when they gratify secret lust, they hang up their quivers on their car yokes to warn off the curious and rash observer. Thus, without a blush, do they prostitute their weapons of war. The dead bodies of their parents they cut up with their sheep and devour at their feasts. They who have not died so as to become food for others are thought to have died an accursed death. Their women are not by their sex softened to modesty. They uncover the breast, from which they suspend their battle axes, and prefer warfare to marriage. In their climate, too, there is the same rude nature. The daytime is never clear, the sun never cheerful, the sky is uniformly cloudy, the whole year is wintry, the only wind that blows is the angry north. Waters melt only by fires, their rivers flow not by reason of the ice, their mountains are covered with heaps of snow. All things are torpid, all stiff with cold. Nothing there has the glow of life, but that ferocity which is given to scenic plays their stories of the sacrifices of the Taurians, the loves of the Colchians, and the torments of the Caucasus. Nothing, however, in Pontus is so barbarous and sad as the fact that Marcion was born there. Well, how's that for an attack? If I had been Marcion, I would be rather proud to have actually inspired such an assault. It's amazing. And Tertullian does have a way with words. Not always quite that outrageously, but nevertheless very, very powerful speaker and writer. Tertullian is considered the father of Latin Christianity. It was he who originated the concept of the Trinity itself. He is the one who said we have one God in three persons, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. He also devised a way of understanding the Trinity that enabled a lot of the controversies that went on in Eastern Christianity for centuries to largely have, well, minimal effect on Western Christianity. And so the things that provoked tremendous debates in the East among the Greek-speaking Christian community in trying to understand how God could be both three and one turned out to be rather straightforwardly and simply stated by Tertullian in a way that persists today, and that allowed Western theologians writing in Latin to largely avoid the metaphysical controversies that plagued the East. Tertullian himself was the son of a Roman centurion. He married, and at some point during his adult life, converted to Christianity. He was skeptical of theology, despite being a great theologian. He was also skeptical of Greek thought, of philosophy in general, but specifically in Greek forms. What does Athens have to do with Jerusalem? He said famously at one point. And that can be taken as an anti-intellectual statement. But I think he meant something much more specific than that. I think he really meant, look, what we find here in Christianity is itself a new system of thought. Don't insist on trying to put it into the categories of Greek thought. It's not going to fit. And so he refused to try to enter into some of the questions about what, metaphysically exactly, a person of God was. He said, it's a new kind of thing. It doesn't fit. Don't try to reconcile this with Greek thought. Greek thought has its own conceptual framework. The Christian conceptual framework is different. One of the things Tertullian does, right at the outset of his critique of Marcion, is to insist on a rule of faith. That rule of faith has both, you might say, a methodological aspect and an aspect relating to the content. So first to the content. It's very easy to understand. It's essentially summed up in the Apostles' Creed. That had already taken its basic form at some point during the first century, and Tertullian recites something very, very close to our modern version of the Apostles' Creed as the content of the rule of faith. The key doctrinal points are simply that God is Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, first of all, and that Jesus was born, lived, died, and was resurrected. That, he said, was the content that was central to the Christian faith, a triune God, and then a Son who was born, lived as a human, died, and then was brought back to life. But what about the methodology? There he says it's a matter of apostolic succession. The ultimate epistemic authority in Christianity is Christ himself. Christ is not only the second person of the Trinity, the Son, but also someone who is in frequent dialogue with the Father. And so we have there the words of God as represented in the gospel accounts. There were also, of course, the disciples, the various apostles who worked with Jesus, or apostles like Paul, who received a different kind of revelation. Those people are second only to Christ himself as epistemic sources. But then we've got, of course, their transmission of what they saw and heard and understood. And so we have to trace things back as far as we can to the apostles, to the disciples, to Jesus himself. That is our methodology. And so Tertullian says, prefer the old to the new. Go back as far as you can to try to understand what is authentic and what is not. Newer interpretations are likely inauthentic. You have to be able to go back to be sure that you are representing the actual content of the faith. So we have a methodological rule of faith. Trace things back as far as you can, ideally to Jesus himself. And we have a content matter of the rule of faith, which is whatever your interpretation is, it better agree that God is Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and that Jesus was born, lived, died, and was resurrected. Those are fundamental to the faith. Tertullian admits that the Old Testament accounts of God and the New Testament accounts of God seem incompatible. Indeed, they appear very different. But he says this is not a real inconsistency, nor is it a description of two different gods. Instead, what's going on here is that we have, to pursue that musical analogy, something like major key and minor key understandings of God. We've got God sometimes in a major key, and then sometimes God in a minor key or some other mode in the Old Testament, and that's all part of God. We can't understand God as strictly in the key of C, major, throughout. Instead, there are different aspects of God that are brought out by different stories in the Hebrew Scriptures and in the New Testament. And so Tertullian says all of that has to be understood as part of God. If you understand it more deeply, you realize it is a complex characterization of a being that lies beyond our complete understanding. It is not a matter of inconsistent descriptions or descriptions of different beings. It is a matter of trying to come to grips in human terms with a being that really transcends us. And so there are going to be major key aspects and minor key aspects of that being. We're not going to be able to understand that being through any simple characterization. And so we need both Old Testament and New Testament to come to a richer understanding of God. To understand how Tertullian goes about reconciling some of what Marcion sees as contradictions, let's take a look at the most basic one. He says that the Old Testament God is a God of justice, and the New Testament God is a God of love and mercy. So let's just contrast justice and mercy. At first glance, you might think they're incompatible. The Old Testament God judges sternly, judges harshly. And the New Testament God forgives, saves, loves. They seem incompatible. But Tertullian says, actually, there's no incompatibility. God's justice is good. God's mercy is good. God, in doing justice, is good. And so really there is no incompatibility between God's justice and God's mercy. We might think of Marcion's conception this way. You have justice on one side, you have mercy on the other side. They often direct different courses of action, and God seems to hover between the two of them. In the Old Testament, most of the time going on the side of justice. In the New Testament, most often going on the side of mercy. But it looks as if there's a real choice to be made, and there's an incompatibility. You can be merciful or you can be just. You can't typically be both. Now, Tertullian thinks that's the wrong picture. In fact, I think his picture is much more Aristotelian. He's thinking of justice and of mercy as means between extremes. So you could think of justice, for example, as a mean between legalism or a kind of stringency, kind of inflexibility on the one hand, and then a kind of injustice on the other hand. Think for a moment about a judge. A judge might view an unjust action and just allow it, allow people to get away with it, and so just permit injustice. Or a judge could follow rules so strictly, so stringently, that we end up thinking that actually the result is unfair. And so a just judge is going to bring mercy and a consideration for the situation into this, not allowing people to get away with injustice, but nevertheless not applying the law so strictly that we get a result that is unjust in a different way. On the other hand, what about mercy? Mercy, too, is a mean between extremes, between being, well, utterly unmerciful, and so not being in any way forgiving or considering people's circumstances, but on the other hand, being indulgent, being lax. And so mercy is really something that is itself a mean between extremes. You can be not merciful enough, but on the other hand, you can be, as it were, too merciful. You can be indulgent. You can become someone who is lax and allows injustice. Now, notice that connection. Suppose we think about a judge being merciful sometimes. Well, a judge should be merciful in the right situations at the right times toward the right defendant, and should show justice at the right times in the right way toward the right defendant. And if we put those two together, we realize, wait a minute, justice and mercy are not incompatible. They're actually related means between extremes. The judge who allows the person to get away with injustice is precisely showing that kind of indulgence or laxness. On the other hand, the judge who applies the law so strictly, we get a kind of injustice in the other direction, is someone who is showing no mercy. And so the judge who gets it right, who actually takes into account the defendant's consideration, but also is concerned with the victim, who actually wants to enforce the law, who wants to come up with a just outcome, is showing both justice and mercy at the same time. So I think from Tertullian's point of view, I wouldn't maybe go so far as to say he's committed to a doctrine of the unity of the virtues, as Socrates is, but he at least thinks that certain kinds of tensions that Marcion sees are not really tensions at all. There is no incompatibility between a God of justice and a God of love and mercy. Think, if you will, about a parent. A parent in raising a child has to enforce certain rules, has to sometimes be strict with the child, has to sometimes be forgiving, throughout has to be loving. And Tertullian is saying that's what God is like. The parent doesn't really, in a sense, face a choice between justice and mercy. Instead thinks, what do I have to do to raise a child, to be a good person? And similarly, Tertullian is saying God looks at us and says, what do I have to do to turn us into good, God-fearing and God-loving people? In both cases, we have to find a mean between extremes. We can't be lax, show nothing but mercy, and spoil the child. But, on the other hand, we can't be so strict. We show no forgiveness, we show no mercy, we show no love. Justice consists in being just and merciful in the right ways at the right times. And so from Tertullian's point of view, there is no incompatibility. We see more of God being, well, a God of justice in the Old Testament. We see more of God's mercy in the New Testament. But throughout both, God is showing both justice and mercy, loving God's people and doing what God needs to do to actually lead people toward him.